Go back to the nursing home, my son said on Thanksgiving, his voice loud enough for the entire table to hear, and in that moment I realized I had never truly known the man I raised. The dining room fell into a silence so complete I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, and the ticking of the wall clock above the china cabinet Daniel had once helped his father hang. The scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon stuffing lingered in the air, warm and familiar, yet something inside me felt cold and distant, as if I were watching someone else's life unfold from the far end of a long hallway. I sat there for a second longer than necessary, my hands folded neatly in my lap, the linen napkin still draped across my knees like a small shield against humiliation. Jessica stared down at her plate, her lips pressed into a thin line that might have been embarrassment or might have been satisfaction. My granddaughter Emily shifted in her chair, her eyes flickering toward me and then quickly away, as though she were afraid of what she might see in my face. I rose slowly, smoothing the wrinkles from my navy cardigan, the one I had worn to every Thanksgiving dinner for the past decade, and offered a polite smile that felt like it belonged to another woman entirely. Outside, the November wind had picked up, carrying dry leaves across the driveway in restless spirals. I walked to my car without saying goodbye, my sensible low heels crunching softly over the gravel. The sky was already turning that deep, bruised shade of purple that comes just before nightfall in late autumn, and the first snowflakes of the season began to fall as I turned the key in the ignition. They landed on the windshield and melted instantly, leaving behind faint, trembling trails that blurred the glow of the porch light behind me. I drove in silence, the radio turned off, my thoughts drifting back to the small boy who used to sit beside me on the living room rug building towers out of wooden blocks, his laughter bright and uncomplicated. Daniel had loved Thanksgiving when he was young. He used to wake up before dawn to watch the Macy's parade on our old television, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of laundry detergent and maple syrup. We would bake pumpkin pies together, his tiny hands dusted with flour as he tried to shape the crust into something resembling a circle. Somewhere between those mornings and this evening, something had shifted in ways I could not fully understand. My apartment building came into view just as the snow began to fall more steadily, soft white flakes covering the cracked sidewalk and the rusted metal railing by the entrance. The hallway inside smelled faintly of bleach and overcooked cabbage, a scent I had grown accustomed to over the past year. I climbed the 2 flights of stairs carefully, one hand gliding along the wall for balance, my chest tightening with a familiar ache that reminded me I was no longer the woman who could carry grocery bags up 3 flights without pausing for breath. When I reached my door, I noticed an envelope lying on the worn welcome mat, its crisp white edges stark against the faded carpet. My name was written across the front in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. For a moment I simply stood there, listening to the muffled sounds of a television playing somewhere down the hall, the distant laughter of strangers who would never know how completely a single sentence could change the shape of a life. I picked up the envelope and turned it over in my hands, feeling the weight of the paper inside, the promise of something I could not yet name. The snow continued to fall outside my window as I stepped into the quiet of my apartment, closing the door behind me with a soft, decisive click that echoed longer than it should have. I did not cry. I did not call anyone. Instead, I placed the envelope on the kitchen table beside a chipped ceramic mug and the stack of unpaid bills I had been avoiding all week, and for the first time that evening, I allowed myself to wonder whether the story my family believed about me was one I would continue to accept. I stood at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at the envelope as if it might open itself and explain everything without forcing me to touch it. The overhead light flickered once before settling into its usual dim glow, casting soft shadows across the peeling linoleum floor. Outside, the snow had begun to collect on the narrow windowsill, forming a thin white border that made the world beyond my glass seem quieter than it really was. I wrapped my hands around the ceramic mug, now filled with lukewarm tea I did not remember pouring, and tried to steady the slight tremor in my fingers. There had been a time when Thanksgiving evenings meant leftovers carefully packed into glass containers, laughter drifting down the hallway as Daniel carried dishes to the sink, his voice teasing me for cooking enough food to feed an entire football team. Tonight there was only the faint hum of the heating vent and the distant sound of sirens somewhere beyond the parking lot. I finally slid my thumb beneath the flap and opened the envelope with deliberate care, unfolding the single sheet of paper inside. The letterhead at the top read Silver Pines Residential Care, printed in an elegant shade of blue that felt oddly cheerful given the knot tightening in my chest. The words that followed were polite, professional, and completely unfamiliar, welcoming me to a facility I had never agreed to enter, and confirming a move-in date that had already passed. For a moment I wondered whether there had been some clerical mistake, whether another Margaret Wilson had somehow become entangled in my life by accident. But then I noticed the signature at the bottom, bold and unmistakable, Daniel Wilson, written in the same confident script he had used on birthday cards when he was a teenager trying to look grown. I lowered myself into the chair beside the table, the wooden legs creaking softly beneath my weight, and let my gaze drift toward the refrigerator door where an old photograph still clung beneath a souvenir magnet from Cape Cod. Daniel stood in that picture with sandy hair falling into his eyes, his arm wrapped around my shoulders as we smiled into the summer sun. He had insisted on taking that trip after his father died, saying we both needed fresh air and the sound of waves to remind us that life could keep moving forward. I had believed him then. I had believed in the steady kindness of the boy who once held my hand while we crossed busy streets and promised he would always take care of me. The radiator clanged suddenly, pulling me back into the present with a jolt that made the letter slip from my lap onto the floor. I did not reach for it right away. Instead, I listened to the sounds of the building settling around me, the quiet rhythm of neighbors living lives that did not intersect with mine. Somewhere above, a child laughed at a television cartoon. Somewhere below, a door slammed shut with casual finality. I rose at last and picked up the paper, smoothing its edges as though it were fragile, as though handling it gently might change what it said. My eyes moved again over the carefully typed sentences, over the assurances of compassionate care and spacious rooms and organized activities designed to enrich the golden years of residence. The phrase golden years lingered in my mind, hollow and distant. I thought about the unpaid bills beside my mug, about the medication bottles lined up like silent witnesses along the counter, about the calendar where I had circled family holidays in hopeful red ink. Snow continued to fall outside, layering the parking lot in soft white silence, erasing tire tracks and footprints until everything looked newly untouched. I folded the letter once, then twice, and placed it back into the envelope with a steadiness I did not entirely feel. There would be time to decide what it meant, time to understand how my life had been quietly redirected without my consent. For now, I moved to the window and watched the streetlights flicker on one by one, small pools of amber glowing against the deepening night, and I realized that whatever path Daniel believed he had chosen for me was only the beginning of a story he had not yet imagined. Morning arrived without ceremony, a pale gray light seeping through the thin curtains and settling over the apartment like dust. I had not slept much. The clock beside my bed read 6:12 when I finally rose, the quiet stiffness in my knees reminding me that time had continued its steady march no matter how desperately I wished to pause it. I moved through my usual routine with careful precision, measuring coffee grounds into the chipped glass pot, turning the dial on the old stove that clicked before the burner caught flame. The familiar scent of brewing coffee filled the small kitchen, wrapping around me like an old memory that did not ask questions. The envelope remained where I had left it on the table, its presence impossible to ignore. Even when I deliberately turned my back to it. Outside, the world looked freshly rewritten beneath a blanket of snow. The cars in the parking lot appeared softer somehow, their sharp edges blurred into gentle shapes that almost seemed inviting. I watched a young man in a thick winter coat scrape frost from his windshield, his breath forming quick white clouds in the cold air, and I wondered whether he knew how fragile plans could be. There had been a time when my mornings were full of purpose. I used to rise before sunrise to prepare Daniel for school, packing lunches with careful notes tucked between sandwiches and apple slices. He would stumble into the kitchen rubbing sleep from his eyes, his hair sticking up in stubborn directions that no comb could fully tame. I could still hear his small voice asking whether I would be there when he got home, and I could still feel the quiet pride that filled my chest each time I assured him that I would. Those promises had seemed simple then, unbreakable in the way only a child believes anything can be. I carried my mug to the table and finally sat across from the envelope, studying it as if it were an unfamiliar guest who had overstayed its welcome. The paper inside no longer felt shocking. Instead, it seemed to carry a strange kind of inevitability, like a chapter in a book I had been reading without realizing. I reached for my calendar hanging beside the refrigerator, and traced my finger over the red circles marking birthdays and holidays that had once anchored my year. Thanksgiving had been followed by Christmas in neat, hopeful ink, but suddenly the distance between those dates felt immeasurable. The radiator hissed softly as it released another breath of heat into the room, and I thought about the conversations I had overheard during recent visits to Daniel's house, the way Jessica would mention assisted living communities with an almost rehearsed casualness, her smile bright and practiced. At the time I had dismissed the comments as polite concern, the kind that families offered when they did not know what else to say. Now they rearranged themselves in my mind like puzzle pieces finally clicking into place. I stood and opened the narrow cupboard above the sink, retrieving a small metal box I had not touched in years. Inside were bank statements, faded insurance papers, and the carefully folded will my husband had insisted we draft long before illness took him from us. His handwriting appeared in the margins in faint blue ink, notes about responsibility and trust that felt painfully relevant now. I set the documents beside the envelope and smoothed them with my palm, feeling the quiet steadiness that came from understanding at least part of the truth. Somewhere down the hall a door opened and closed, footsteps echoing briefly before fading away. Life continued around me, indifferent and ordinary. I took a sip of coffee that had already begun to cool and allowed myself to consider a possibility I had been avoiding since the night before. Perhaps the story Daniel believed he was writing for me was not yet finished. Perhaps there were still pages left that belonged entirely to my own hand. The thought did not bring anger or sorrow. It brought a calm I had not expected, like the stillness that settles over a frozen lake, just before the first brave step is taken across its surface. I spent the rest of that morning sorting through drawers I had not opened in years, moving slowly from one corner of the apartment to another, as if the act of organizing could somehow bring order to thoughts that refused to settle. Dust clung to the edges of old photographs and holiday cards, tiny reminders of seasons when my life had revolved around family schedules and school calendars, rather than appointment slips and prescription refills. I found a small wooden frame tucked behind a stack of cookbooks and paused when I saw the image inside. Daniel stood beside me at his college graduation, his arm draped across my shoulders with easy affection, his smile wide and full of promise. I remembered the way he had searched for me in the crowd that day, waving with boyish enthusiasm when our eyes finally met across rows of folding chairs set up on a sunlit lawn. He had told me then that everything he accomplished was because I had never given up on him. The memory felt almost surreal now, like a story I had once read rather than a moment I had actually lived. I set the frame carefully on the kitchen counter and continued my quiet inventory, stacking papers into neat piles that reflected a life reduced to numbers and signatures. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, leaving the sky a pale winter blue that seemed both hopeful and indifferent. I wrapped my scarf around my neck and stepped into the hallway, deciding without much deliberation to take a walk. The cold air met me with sharp clarity as I pushed open the building door, and I drew a slow breath that filled my lungs with something close to resolve. The sidewalks were slick but manageable, and I moved at a steady pace past rows of identical brick buildings whose windows glowed with midday light. At the corner, the small grocery store where I often bought discounted bread stood quiet except for a delivery truck idling near the curb. The driver nodded politely as I passed, unaware that his simple acknowledgement felt like an unexpected kindness. I continued toward the park 2 blocks away, my boots leaving faint impressions in the thin layer of snow that had not yet melted. Children bundled in bright coats chased one another across the frozen grass, while their parents watched from wooden benches dusted with white. I chose a seat beneath a leafless maple tree, and allowed my thoughts to drift once more toward the envelope waiting back in my apartment. The decision to place me somewhere else had not been made overnight. It had grown slowly, nurtured by conversations I had dismissed and silences I had chosen not to question. I could see that now with uncomfortable clarity. Jessica's careful suggestions about downsizing, Daniel's sudden interest in my finances, the way visits had become shorter and less frequent over the past year. None of it had seemed urgent enough to challenge at the time. None of it had felt like a warning. A gust of wind rattled the bare branches above me, scattering a few stubborn leaves that had managed to cling through the first snowfall. I pulled my coat tighter and closed my eyes for a moment, listening to the distant sound of traffic and the muffled laughter of children who still believed the world would always make sense. When I opened them again, I noticed a young woman standing nearby with her phone pressed to her ear, her voice low and urgent as she spoke. Something in her expression reminded me of Emily, of the way my granddaughter's eyes had filled with quiet worry during that last family dinner. The memory stirred a new awareness inside me, one that felt less like grief and more like preparation. I rose from the bench and began the walk back home, my steps measured but purposeful, the winter sun casting long shadows across the path ahead. By the time I reached my building, I understood that whatever future Daniel had arranged in careful ink and official letterhead was not yet set in stone. There were still conversations to be had, truths to be uncovered, and choices that belonged entirely to me. When I stepped back into my apartment that afternoon, the quiet no longer felt suffocating. It felt deliberate, as though the walls themselves were waiting to see what I would do next. I removed my coat slowly and hung it on the brass hook near the door, noticing how the fabric still held the faint scent of winter air and distant wood smoke from someone's fireplace. The envelope remained on the table beside the metal box of documents, exactly where I had left it, but now it seemed less like a threat and more like an invitation to understand the truth I had avoided for too long. I warmed a bowl of leftover soup on the stove and stood watching the steam rise in soft curls toward the ceiling, remembering how Daniel used to complain about eating the same meals 2 days in a row. He had always preferred variety, excitement, new opportunities. I wondered when that desire had extended to rearranging my life without asking permission. After I finished eating, I sat down with my husband's old address book, its leather cover worn smooth from years of use. His careful handwriting filled the pages, listing friends, colleagues, and professionals who had once formed a network of quiet support around our family. I traced my finger over a familiar name and paused, feeling the stir of something that might have been courage. Richard Caldwell had handled our legal affairs for more than 20 years before retiring. He had attended our anniversary parties, sent flowers when Daniel graduated, and stood beside me at the funeral with a steady hand on my shoulder. I had not spoken to him in months, yet the thought of hearing his measured voice now brought a surprising sense of relief. I dialed the number slowly, listening to the ring echo through the small kitchen, half expecting it to lead nowhere. Instead, he answered on the third attempt, his tone warm with recognition even before I finished introducing myself. We spoke about ordinary things at first, the weather, the changing seasons, the way time seemed to accelerate after 70. Then I told him about the letter, about the arrangements made without my knowledge, about the quiet realization that my son had begun to view me as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. Richard did not interrupt. He listened with the same patient attention he had always offered, and when I finished, he asked a single question that lingered long after the call ended. Do you know who truly holds the authority over your affairs? I sat with that thought as the afternoon light faded into early evening, the apartment growing dim around me until I rose to switch on the lamp beside the couch. Shadows gathered in the corners like unspoken memories. I opened the metal box again and removed the documents we had signed years ago, unfolding them carefully to study the signatures and dates that now seemed to carry new weight. Somewhere beyond the walls of my building, life continued at its usual pace, cars passing over wet pavement, neighbors returning from work with grocery bags in their arms. Yet inside my small living room, something had shifted with quiet certainty. I understood now that decisions made in hushed conversations could be questioned. Plans drawn in confident ink could be challenged. I placed the papers back into their box and set it beside my handbag, a simple act that felt like the first step in a direction Daniel had not anticipated. The night settled outside with a softness that belied its cold, and as I prepared for bed, I realized that the story unfolding around me was no longer defined by what had been taken away. It was beginning slowly and deliberately to be shaped by what I chose to reclaim. I woke before dawn the next morning with a clarity that felt unfamiliar yet strangely welcome, as if the quiet hours had given my thoughts room to settle into something more purposeful. The apartment was still wrapped in darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside my window, casting long pale lines across the floor. I moved through my routine with deliberate calm, preparing oatmeal and a slice of toast while listening to the low murmur of early traffic beginning to stir beyond the parking lot. The metal box and the envelope waited on the table like silent companions, reminders that the life I had accepted for so long was beginning to shift beneath my feet. After breakfast, I dressed more carefully than usual, choosing the charcoal wool coat my husband had bought me on our last trip to Chicago, smoothing my silver hair with a precision that surprised even me. There was something steady in the act of preparation, something that suggested I was no longer simply reacting to circumstances but shaping them. I placed the documents into my handbag and stepped outside into the crisp morning air, the remnants of yesterday's snow crunching softly beneath my boots. The bus stop stood at the corner beneath a flickering sign, its metal bench dusted with frost that sparkled in the first light of sunrise. I had not taken the bus downtown in years, yet the route felt familiar as I watched the city pass in muted winter colors through the fogged window. Old brick storefronts gave way to glass towers that reflected the pale sky, and I found myself remembering how Daniel used to sit beside me on similar rides, asking endless questions about the future he was certain would be bright. When the bus finally hissed to a stop near Richard Caldwell's office, I stepped onto the sidewalk with a steadiness that came not from confidence but from necessity. His building rose above the street with quiet authority, its polished lobby echoing faintly with the sound of distant footsteps. Richard greeted me with the same gentle nod he had offered at my husband's funeral, his office lined with shelves of law books that smelled faintly of paper and time. We spoke for nearly an hour, his questions precise yet compassionate as he reviewed the documents I had carried so carefully across the city. He explained in measured tones that decisions about my residence and finances could not be enforced without my consent, that the authority Daniel believed he held was more complicated than he understood. There were legal safeguards, he said, protections that had been placed there years ago precisely because my husband had worried about how vulnerable I might one day become. As I listened, a quiet realization settled over me like the snowfall the night before. I had not been abandoned by circumstance. I had simply forgotten the strength of the foundations we had built together. When I left Richard's office, the winter sun had risen high enough to warm the edges of the pavement, and for the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt the faintest hint of something that resembled anticipation. I stopped at a small cafe on the corner and ordered a cup of coffee I did not truly need, sitting by the window as people hurried past wrapped in scarves and urgent thoughts. My reflection in the glass looked older than I remembered, yet there was a steadiness in my eyes that had not been there before. I thought about Daniel, about the choices he had made in quiet conversations and confident assumptions, and I understood that the story he had begun was about to take a turn he had not planned. By the time I returned to my apartment, the sky had shifted into that clear winter blue that promises both cold and possibility, and I knew with quiet certainty that the next move would belong entirely to me. That evening I placed the kettle on the stove and stood watching the small blue flame flicker beneath it, feeling a quiet sense of control settle into my bones for the first time in months. The apartment no longer felt like a place where I was waiting for something to happen. It felt like a space where decisions could be made. I set out my husband's old fountain pen beside a fresh sheet of paper, noticing how the weight of it in my hand brought back memories of long kitchen table conversations about responsibility and dignity. He had always believed that preparation was a form of protection, that a calm mind could outlast even the most unexpected storms. I understood what he meant now more than ever. Outside the window the sky darkened early, winter shortening the days until time itself seemed to move in smaller, more deliberate steps. I reviewed the notes I had taken during my meeting with Richard Caldwell, tracing each sentence as though committing it to memory would make it more real. Consent, ownership, authority. Words that once belonged to another world of legal language now felt deeply personal, like tools I had finally remembered how to use. The telephone rang just as the kettle began to whistle, its sharp sound cutting cleanly through the silence. I hesitated before answering, already knowing who it might be. Daniel's voice carried a strained brightness that reminded me of the way he used to sound when he was trying to hide a broken report card. He asked how I was doing, whether I had received the information he had arranged, whether I had begun preparing for the transition he believed was inevitable. I listened without interrupting, allowing him to fill the space with explanations about comfort and safety, and the importance of planning ahead. There was concern in his tone, but it felt distant, wrapped in layers of assumption that left little room for understanding. When he finally paused, I spoke quietly, choosing each word with care. I told him I had indeed received the letter. I told him I had spent the day considering what it meant, and then I told him that I would be making my own decisions about where and how I lived. The silence that followed stretched longer than I expected, long enough for the kettle to cool and the steam to fade into nothing. He responded with polite confusion at first, then with a hint of frustration that sounded almost unfamiliar coming from the boy who once clung to my hand at crowded fairs. I did not raise my voice. I did not explain everything I had learned. I simply said that we would talk soon in person, when there was time for both of us to listen. After I hung up, I poured the tea into my favorite mug and carried it to the living room, settling into the armchair beside the lamp. Snow had begun to fall again, softer this time, drifting past the glass like tiny reminders that change rarely arrives all at once. I thought about Emily, about the worry I had seen in her eyes and the quiet loyalty she had always shown in small gestures. Family was not always defined by who made the loudest decisions. Sometimes it revealed itself in who chose to pay attention. I reached for the calendar once more and drew a new circle around a date 2 weeks away, the ink dark and certain against the white page. There would be a conversation then, one that might reshape more than Daniel realized. I set the pen down and leaned back, allowing the stillness of the room to settle around me like a promise. For the first time since that long Thanksgiving evening, I no longer felt like a guest in my own life. I felt like someone who had quietly stepped back into her rightful place, ready to face whatever came next with a calm that could not be taken from her. I spent the following days preparing in ways that would have seemed ordinary to anyone watching from the outside. Yet each small action carried a quiet intention that only I fully understood. I cleaned the apartment more thoroughly than I had in months, wiping down kitchen counters until they shone faintly beneath the soft overhead light, folding blankets with careful precision, and placing fresh flowers in the chipped glass vase my husband had once bought at a roadside market. Order had always given me clarity, and now clarity felt like a form of strength. The calendar on the wall became my silent partner, each passing day marked with a small deliberate line that brought me closer to the conversation I knew could not be avoided. Snow continued to fall on and off throughout the week, dusting the sidewalks and rooftops in layers that softened the hard outlines of the city. I walked often, choosing routes that took me past places tied to memories I had not visited in years. The library where Daniel used to complete his homework at a corner table while I browsed cookbooks. The playground where he had once insisted he was brave enough to climb the tallest slide. These recollections no longer made my chest tighten. Instead, they felt like reminders of the long path that had led both of us to this moment. A path shaped by love, misunderstanding, and the quiet ways families sometimes lose their footing. One afternoon, as I returned from the grocery store with a small bag of essentials balanced against my hip, I noticed a familiar figure waiting near the entrance of my building. Emily stood there wrapped in a thick wool coat, her breath forming quick clouds in the cold air, her expression a mixture of relief and uncertainty when she saw me. We spoke softly in the hallway, the scent of damp boots and winter coats lingering around us. She told me she had sensed tension growing at home, that her parents had been discussing timelines and arrangements in hushed voices that left her uneasy. There was no accusation in her words, only a sincerity that made me realize how deeply she still believed in fairness. I reassured her that I was all right, that sometimes adults needed time to untangle situations that seemed straightforward on the surface. She nodded, though her eyes searched mine for a reassurance I could not fully provide. Before she left, she pressed a small notebook into my hands, explaining that she had written down things she had overheard, dates and details she thought might matter. I accepted it with gratitude, aware that loyalty often reveals itself in quiet gestures rather than grand declarations. That evening I sat at the kitchen table turning the pages she had filled with careful handwriting, noticing patterns I had overlooked before. Conversations about selling property, references to financial accounts I had not reviewed recently, plans presented as solutions rather than questions. The realization did not bring anger. It brought a deeper understanding of how easily intentions can shift when people convince themselves they are acting for the greater good. I closed the notebook and set it beside the documents from Richard Caldwell, feeling the pieces of my situation align into a clearer picture. Outside, the streetlights flickered on one by one, casting warm halos across the snow-covered pavement. I brewed another cup of tea and allowed the quiet to settle around me like a companion rather than an adversary. The date I had circled approached steadily, and with it came the knowledge that the next chapter of this story would be written not in solitude, but in the presence of those who had shaped my life in ways both tender and painful. I no longer feared that moment. I welcomed it with the calm certainty of someone who had finally remembered her own voice. The morning of the meeting arrived wrapped in a quiet stillness that felt almost ceremonial, as if the world itself had paused to witness what would unfold. I dressed with the same careful attention I had given every significant day of my life, fastening the pearl buttons on my navy blouse one by one while sunlight filtered through the thin curtains and painted soft rectangles across the bedroom floor. The calendar date I had circled now seemed less like a warning and more like a doorway, an invitation to step fully into the role I had been preparing for without realizing it. I brewed coffee but barely tasted it, my thoughts steady rather than anxious, focused on the conversations that would soon replace the silence of the past weeks. When I left the apartment, the air carried a crisp brightness that made each breath feel sharp and cleansing. Snow had melted into clear rivulets along the curb, reflecting the pale blue sky in fleeting mirrors that shifted as cars passed. Daniel's house stood at the end of a quiet suburban street lined with bare maple trees, their branches etched like delicate drawings against the winter light. I paused at the gate for a moment, remembering the afternoons I had spent there helping Emily with school projects, listening to her excited stories about friends and dreams that still felt limitless. The front door opened before I could knock, Jessica's expression carefully composed as she welcomed me inside. The scent of freshly brewed tea and polished wood filled the entryway, a domestic calm that contrasted with the tension I sensed beneath the surface. Daniel stood in the living room with his hands clasped loosely in front of him, as though rehearsing what he might say. For a heartbeat I saw the boy he had once been, hopeful and uncertain, searching my face for reassurance. We sat together at the dining table where sunlight pooled across the varnished surface, illuminating the neat stack of papers I had brought. I spoke first, my voice measured and clear as I explained what I had learned about my rights, about the legal boundaries that could not be crossed without my consent. I told them I understood their concerns, that aging carried challenges none of us could fully predict, but that decisions about my life would be guided by respect rather than convenience. Daniel listened with a stillness that surprised me, his earlier confidence replaced by a thoughtful silence that suggested he was finally hearing words he had not expected. Jessica's gaze moved from my face to the documents and back again, her composure wavering just enough to reveal uncertainty where certainty had once lived. When I finished, I did not demand apologies or offer accusations. I simply placed the papers between us and allowed the weight of truth to settle into the room like a quiet snowfall. Emily appeared in the doorway then, her presence gentle yet resolute, as though she had been waiting for this moment to understand the family she loved from a new perspective. No one raised their voice. No dramatic declarations filled the air. Instead, there was a long shared silence that held the possibility of change. Daniel finally reached for the documents, reading them slowly, his shoulders easing as realization replaced assumption. Outside, the winter sun slipped behind a drifting cloud, softening the light that filtered through the window. I realized then that the story that had begun with humiliation and distance was finding its way towards something more complex and more honest than any of us had anticipated. When I rose to leave, Daniel walked me to the door with a quiet respect that felt unfamiliar yet deeply welcome. The cold air met me once more as I stepped onto the porch, carrying with it the subtle promise that even fractured relationships could find a path toward understanding if someone was willing to stand calmly in the truth. I walked down the path without looking back, aware that the future remained unwritten but no longer uncertain, my footsteps steady against the pavement as I reclaimed not only my independence but the quiet dignity that had always been mine to keep.